All right. So we had three breakout questions in the chat. What did this course teach you about African people? What did this course teach you about yourself? And what will you take with you from this course? Who would like to discuss what was talked about in the breakout groups?
I can go for number 3. For sure, what I will take away, I think in our group we could agree, Stacy, Cassandra, and myself, that what we'll take away is that we just could read more. Like as we were both like well, I don't want to speak for y'all, but I'm gonna speak. um we took away that we were mind blown by, different things of learning, like Stacy mentioned the Moors, and then I was mentioned, and then she also brought up like how the Moors were teaching everybody, like, how to wash your hands and not like being sanitary and what have you, as well as learning about, what else did Stacy say? How oh, how sophisticated, um our ancestors were, like on the ship that you mentioned last week, professor, like going from learning a language to whoever they may have been enslaved by, to land, being brought to a new land, having to learn another language, and who knows what else, like they may have had to learn just to survive, like, they're forced to learn another language or multiple languages, just to survive. So it was kind of cool how really sophisticated and innovative, our ancestors are. And I was bringing up the point that it's just really nice to take this class to read a material that was written by us, for us, and like by our actual ancestors. And what I was telling Stacy and Cassandra is that it's kind of crazy when you read material, you have to definitely check your source, because it's people writing histories that aren't even from the culture, or that it's false. It's a false narrative that's been created, for sure, for me and like most of us in these predominantly white institutions. So taking away for our group, we want to read more, to be better educated, for sure. Stacy, myself, Cassandra, I don't know, yeah, to be better educated and to fact check like the sources that we're reading material from. So yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? We had Caitlin, Kennedy, and Damien's group. Who would like to kind of talk about what was discussed in your group?
I can definitely talk a little bit about that. Are we sticking to the same first question, or do you want to move on?
Whatever one you speaks to you most.
Okay, I was talking a little bit about I was talking about how, while I am not obviously African American, I'm not Black, I really enjoyed the class, as I've said before. But I also look at this class as like, there's more knowledge that can be done in every culture, in every race, I mean, everywhere. And I really look at it, interestingly enough, as like, being that I am like Mexican, what history from Mexico are we not being exposed to? What is that, what more really enjoyed, just even the beginning of the class, the terminology switch up that you presented, I think what will stay with me for a long time will be looking at things more like in a world making view, and how we refer to things can really change dynamics, and can, uplift people, instead of, bring them down, or narrowing it down to a piece of history that was like brought to us through a lens of like white, American cisgendered society. So for me, I really am going to come out of this class. I actually already have looked for classes in this genre that are, centered around Mexican history and Mexican culture, so I can continue to learn more about like the diversity of it. I also wanted to point out, I know that someone in my group had mentioned they didn't know about the Wakanda extra credit.
Okay.
So I just wanted to like reiterate that that's something that you offered to us. I know it's something that I want to take part in because I was really interested in seeing how they were going to portray Mayan culture, because that's the first time I had ever really seen it portrayed in like such a huge, version, and then in that world making view. So I know that it's something that you offered for those who might have not caught that.
Yeah, definitely. And then real quick, Damien, just because you mentioned taking other courses within the Ethnic Studies department, Gerald Clark is a professor who teaches on indigeneity. So that is someone you may want to look into to kind of further your research about learning. You say you want to learn about Aztec and Mayan culture. He may be more proficient in that realm. Again, his name is Gerald Clark. I believe he sits as the assistant chair of the Ethnic Studies Department. So that would be a great resource to kind of further your study in that regard.
Gerald Clark?
Gerald Clark. Yeah, let me double check. My bad with names. Hold on.
You're right. It's Gerald Clark. I'm in his class now.
Okay.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, I'm actually meeting with this might be TMI, but I'm actually meeting with a counselor about taking classes at other universities and other community colleges. So I'll definitely keep an eye out for you, Professor, on I know you teach at several other universities. Like Cerritos is really close to me.
Okay. And then too, like for everybody, like that's my personal email. That's not even my campus email. So if anything outside, UCR related, you can hit me too. But we'll talk about all of that after we get through. Omi, you had your hand up?
Yeah, so I was just gonna say on the Mayan thing, the Maya Codex is actually at the Getty Center right now, and it's free to go see if anybody wants to take a trip out there to go see it. I saw it this weekend, and it was like,
I know you went without me.
And I went with my ex.
Oh, messy.
I know, it was amazing. It was a really emotional experience. It was so cool. Just like being there. It was awesome. I highly recommend the rest of the museum is boo. But all you have to do is pay for parking, and the later you go in the day, the less it is to pay. I only paid like $15 to park. But yeah, shit was dope.
Cool.
And then to add to it, in case anyone's interested, if you can afford it, the Academy of Motion Pictures Museum actually dedicated their whole third floor to Black cinema in America, motion picture. Like it's everything on the third floor. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, my parents went. They said it's really good. So yeah, it's a really good call. Yeah. Kennedy, you had your hand up?
Yes. I just wanted to share what I got out of this class. I just really liked how you approached the class through a different perspective, not what we're used to per se. Like sitting in rows and just like you teaching us everything and then us just absorbing it. It was more like a conversation. I really appreciated that type of atmosphere because it was more welcoming, and I felt like you were more inclined to share your thoughts. That's something that I took out the class. Like, it doesn't always have to be boring and stuff. It can be very conversational based.
Thank you, Kennedy. Damon, did you have your hand raised?
I was just gonna talk about really quick because like a lot of us from ASP went to go see Wakanda movies. So, but if I figured we could talk about the extra credit stuff like later.
Yeah. What I definitely want to do is get through the study guide, so that way you guys feel comfortable with your final. Okay. So if there's no further questions, let me pull up sharing my screen, and then we'll work through the study guide. It's really up to you all how you want to do it. What I find is helpful is just kind of like answering the questions, or discussing briefly about each posed question. And the way that this works for me is like, if you could answer these questions, you would have no problem answering any question on the final. So that's kind of how we're going to conceptualize the study guide. Really for me, go ahead, Damon.
Really quick, I know he's gonna go over the study guide, but would you guys be down to like share a doc where we like collaborate on the questions?
I think the game plan was we were gonna maybe link up or something, and just kind of like discuss ideas, or maybe we could do like a Zoom or something. But I don't know about sharing a doc.
So why don't y'all have that conversation after class, so that way we can at least work through the material on the study guide, because we don't have a lot of time. I don't want to keep you too long beyond the class time. Cool. Okay. So we're looking at the book, which was kind of like our first reading, Pan-Africanism, the Idea and the Movement. And so one, you should be able to provide your own working definition of Pan-Africanism. Now, of course, you could pull from the text itself, but you want to be able to like kind of articulate it in your own words. If I pose you a question like this for the final, I would definitely look for your words opposed to you just re-articulating what's written in the book. If anything, you could pose what's written in the book, but I want to see you elaborate, even if it would be a problematization or building upon what's already written. Does that make sense? If you all would like, we could kind of pose some working definitions of Pan-Africanism, and we can kind of grapple through those if you would like. Okay. So the second question, if you will, I'm asking you to provide evidence of the theoretical manifestation of Pan-Africanism. So how is Pan-Africanism materialized in theory, right? And what evidence would you be able to provide of that materialization or of that manifestation? So not more so, what are the concrete manifestations? What are the material manifestations? What are the practical manifestations? That's not what's being asked, but what are the theoretical manifestations of Pan-Africanism? So how does it evolve in thought, to put it very plainly, right? Are there any questions, comments, or somebody wants to provide a response to that question or that statement? What are the theoretical manifestations?
Is this in modern day or just throughout the course of the years that you give from
So it's
76 to
applying explicitly to the text. Everything that the final is working through when it's pertaining to a question is working through the text. So you could integrate modern day or contemporary analysis, right? But the only point of integrating that contemporary analysis is to address what is being discussed within the text. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So you will kind of lose points, if you will, if you're interjecting information that does not necessarily deal with information on the text. Now, again, you could build on that information, right? You could complicate that information with outside sources, but the source of the material, the root of the material has to be that text. Caitlin?
I was just gonna say for that particular question,
Okay.
maybe a possible response could be from Pan-Africanism from idea to movement, from that chapter on page 49. It talks about how the Second Pan-African Congregation took place from the 23rd to the 25th of July. And then it says how, like, in theory, it was supposed to bring closer in touch with other peoples of African descent throughout the world. So maybe that can be a sort of theory manifestation of Pan-Africanism.
So here, that's a great point, but this is where we want to draw the distinction, right? Because what they're talking about is the Congress, right? And that Congress, that's a physical manifestation because that's something that actually happened. Now, where you're correct, right, is the idea that we want to bring African people together, right? So what that conference was theorizing would be the answer to the question, right? But what you want to disaggregate, what you want to separate is the physical manifestation, which is that conference or that Congress. Does that make sense, Kaylin?
Yeah. So not so much the Congress itself, but like what the Congress was trying to do. Okay,
exactly.
Thank you.
Exactly. Perfect. It's exactly where you want to be at. So yes, that would be a theoretical manifestation of Pan-Africanism. Another place that you could look, would be like those tracks that made it across the Atlantic that Gilroy is attentive to, that Marcus Garvey was very responsible for, right? These little newspapers and pamphlets that became illegal, that became contraband for those within the nautical culture, right? Those pamphlets, those tracts, those leaflets were theoretical manifestations of Pan-Africanism, because they're talking about the ideas of how Pan-Africanism can be manifested. So that's another place that you can kind of look and kind of excavate for where theoretical manifestations of Pan-Africanism may lie. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay. So these are getting, this next question is getting more so to some of the people, right? Some of the individuals, the main characters, right? So who were some of the main theoretical progenitors of Pan-African ideation? All it's saying is who were some of the main people, right, who thought of Pan-African ideas, right? And I'm asking you to include women. So just like with the answer that Caitlin offered us, right, where she's placing us to these congresses and these conferences, that again is a good place of investigation. But what you want to look at is not what's happening at the conference or the Congress, but who is at the conference or the Congress, right? And then be attentive to the women who are there, right? Because often what happens in the telling and the historical narratives of Pan-Africanism is always told from a male gaze and from a male lens, and it effaces the women who were central to the development of Pan-Africanism. So when you're looking at these people who are involved in the movement from an ideological, from an idea standpoint, right? Be critical and careful to be attentive to the women. Does that question make sense? Does anyone have any questions, comments, or thoughts about that particular question? Okay, so the final question for this book, how does Pan-Africanism evolve from an idea to a movement? How central were the conferences and congresses to the development of the movement? So now you're dealing with the conferences and the congresses, right? So one way to think about the evolutions of the question, it kind of leads you up to the conferences and the congresses, but you're understanding why these conferences and these congresses become important. Does that make sense? Because one, you need to understand what they were thinking about at the conferences and the congresses, which is the theoretical manifestation of Pan-Africanism, right? Once you understand what they were thinking about, then the question becomes, who were thinking these thoughts, right? So who are the progenitors of Pan-African ideation, of Pan-African ideas, right? And then from there, you can begin to start to talk about the conference and the Congress, because now you have a framework and a foundation to begin to understand the conferences and the congresses. Does that make sense? Is there any questions, comments, or concerns about that book? I'm sorry, Cassandra. Right now, you with us, Cassandra? Okay, Caitlin, go ahead.
So I have a question about the second question, who are some of the main theoretical, sorry, the third question. I know you want us to include women, but correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe I wasn't reading carefully, or I have to reread, but was there a lot of like ideas? Like I know they mentioned Mrs. Annie J. Cooper, but like, do they talk about any of her ideas in the readings? So then we just mentioned like who she is, but not like, unless, do you want us to look further in her ideas, like a simple
No. I'm not gonna ask you, that's extra work, right? So to be honest with you, just to like, fuck it, since you took it there, we'll let the cat out the bag. I was really looking for you all to mention her name at some capacity, right? Hopefully that will spark the curiosity to go look at her a little further. But really, this is one of her probably more famous books, A Voice from the South, and it's really about how she produces this form of pedagogy. But anyway, the idea is really for you to mention the role, not the women who were at play, right? And you're absolutely right. We don't get too much of a theoretical insight to these women, but I just want them to be mentioned. I want them to be recognized, because whether we're talking about who said such thing, right? When we're thinking about the question of the theoretical manifestation, right? The second question, you have to understand that Anna Julia Cooper, for example, was a part of that theory being produced, right? We can't assume that she was just there and not saying anything, right? She was contributing at some capacity to the production of that theoretical framework. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So are we okay to move to Tony Martin's book, The Pan-African Connection? So I'm looking at the first bullet here with the gray highlight. What were Marcus Garvey's contributions to the development of Pan-Africanism, right? So again, think of this almost as a buildup, right? So now that we know what the theories of Pan-Africanism were, right, and how they manifest and materialize, what do we know about Garvey that contributes to what we've learned about Pan-Africanism, right? You don't necessarily have to separate the text. It's great to bring them into conversation. So now that we have an understanding of Pan-Africanism, now that we have our working definition of Pan-Africanism, how does Marcus Garvey contribute to its development, right? Does anybody want to speak to that or have a question about that? Let me ask you this. What is Marcus Garvey's organization? Does anyone know?
One second. I had it in my notes. I think I have it here. Yeah, he had the it was the Universal Negro Improvement Association that he, I think, founded.
Yeah.
And one of their publishments was The Negro World, which was suppressed by the British governments in colonized countries.
Yes, thank you. So these are contributions to Pan-Africanism, right? And Damien mentions the Negro World. And think about what I said earlier, as far as the theoretical manifestations of Pan-Africanism and these tracts and these leaflets and these pamphlets that were spread across the Atlantic through nautical culture, right? Marcus Garvey is central within that process. That Negro World is central to the spread of Pan-Africanism, Pan-African theory, right? To Pan-African ideation. So really, that's one of the foundational contributions of Marcus Garvey is the Negro World. Also, keep in mind his Black Star Line shipping company, which transported goods back and forth between the United States and Africa, okay? And this kind of bleeds into the second question, detail the ways in which Garvey's international presence contributed to the spread of Pan-Africanism. And there's a couple of ways we could think about his international presence, right? Where he was forced to travel because where he could not travel, right? That's a way that you could kind of theorize this question, thinking about, okay, he was barred from coming to this country, right? There's a whole chapter dedicated to Garvey not being able to make it into the United States, which forces him to be international, right? So that's one way of approaching this question. But then you can just think about point blank period, where he traveled to, right? You can think about, again, the Negro World and how that was able to traverse the Atlantic and how that added to this Pan-African idea from an international and global perspective. Is there any questions, comments, or thoughts about this question? Okay. So again, don't think of, let me go back up. Don't think of these books as too far separate, right? Because, and then I'm gonna tell you why. For the last question, what were the ways Garvey instilled self-determination into African people, right? Into the African diaspora. One of the things you could think about as it pertains to self-determination is this idea of self-pride, right? Self-pride allows you to self-determine. For me, when I think about self-pride and I think about Marcus Garvey, I automatically think about the red, black, and green flag, right? The flag of Pan-Africanism. I've mentioned in lectures the massive parades that Marcus Garvey would put on, and the regal military regalia that he would have the members of the UNIA wear, right? These are ways that he instilled self-pride to help help establish this idea of self-determination, right? Making sure that women have their own wing within the UNIA, with the Nurses Association, things of that nature, is where he's helped to establish self-determination. Establishing notions of do for self, right? I think that's one of Marcus Garvey's greatest contributions to self-determination, is to instill into African people to do for self. Is there any questions, comments, or thoughts about
Was that, sorry, do for self or do
do
for
for self? Do for self, like, so if you need something done, do it for yourself, right? So if you need a school to be built, you know, let's not go to the government, let's not go to colonial forces and ask for money for them to build our school. You do that for yourself. So you do for self. Does that make sense, Damien?
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect, perfect, okay. So keeping with this idea of self-determination, and as we move into Getachu's text, World Making After Empire, the rise and fall of self-determination. So again, thinking about these texts in conversation, I'm asking you to provide your own working definition of world making. Again, like I'm asking with Pan-Africanism, you could pull from Getachu's text and quote that, that's fine, but I'm really going to be looking for you to provide the definition in your own words, right? Whether that's building on her text or complicating that text, but I'm really looking for you to kind of put this notion of world making into your own words. How does Getachew seek to complicate or problematize notions of nationhood and nation building? One, we talked about how even the idea of world making is a extension, a promulgation, or a cut through what was called nation building, right? And its nation building from a more expansive notion, right? So instead of being concerned about building specific nations and nationhoods within a continent, it's really about shaping and developing these more expansive worlds, right? So be prepared to discuss how Getachew makes that cut through this idea of nationhood and nation building. Does anyone have any questions or comments about that? Okay. So finally, as we deal with this text, who is Getachew investigating when she's thinking about her project for world making? Who are the progenitors, if you will, or who are the protagonists within this text? And what are their role or intersections with Pan-Africanism? So off top, you should be thinking Kwame Nkrumah. She starts the book off with Nkrumah's liberation of Ghana, right? And so that shouldn't be too hard to try to think about how Kwame Nkrumah intersects with Pan-Africanism. That takes us right back to Pan-Africanism, the idea and the movement, as Kwame Nkrumah is a central character within that text as well. Okay, any question about the world making book? Okay, so we'll move into Gilroy's Black Atlantic. We'll automatically want to be comfortable with discussing the idea of double consciousness. Did we talk about Du Bois in this class when we talked about double consciousness? I want to say
yes.
Yes. Okay. So if you are going to bring any outside material as it pertains to Gilroy and double consciousness, I would strongly recommend it being Du Bois, right? The only other thing I could think of, and we didn't cover it in this semester, so it wouldn't make sense, would be Fanon's alienation. But again, we didn't cover it this semester, so it really wouldn't make sense. But if you're gonna bring any outside material to bring in conversation with Gilroy, I would suggest Du Bois' double consciousness. Damien?
Sorry, it's just a quick question. It might not be necessary for the assignment,
Okay.
but do you recall the book by Du Bois, or it might have been a poem, where I think he goes to like Switzerland or Europe or somewhere overseas, and I think no one had ever seen like a someone Black, and he went there.
Is it Du Bois or Baldwin?
It's Baldwin. Sorry.
Stranger in the Village is what it's the
There we
title.
go.
Yep. Really
Sorry,
good.
I thought
Really good
because
essay.
I got them confused because I think in a sense they both talked about like double consciousness, and so I thought it was kind of the same idea, but
Yeah.
never mind.
So what, wrong person, but you're absolutely right. Baldwin is talking about that double consciousness. And then what's interesting about Baldwin, Damien, in that essay, is he's talking about the double consciousness of those who occupy white bodies. And it's phenomenal because of that point.
Yeah, it was a great one.
Yeah, it's phenomenal because of that point. Good call out. Damon?
Yes, really quick. Could you, because I remember we talked about Du Bois. He's done some stuff. I remember we talked about double consciousness, I think a few weeks ago, but could you explain how, like, what does Du Bois have to do with that concept?
I'll do you one better. Give me 1 second. All right. Souls of Black folks of our spiritual striving, okay? Page 9, the first opening paragraph. I'm gonna move a little bit towards the middle of this opening paragraph, though. It is a particular sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of the other, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on you in amused contempt and pity. This is important. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled striving, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Right? So how Du Bois is articulating this idea or this concept or this notion of double consciousness, right? It's a notion of what you could also call two-ness. So within one body, right, you have a dual identity, an American, a Negro, right? An American, a Black man, an American, an African, right? Within one body. But within this duality, right? These two souls, these two thoughts, he calls them two unreconciled strivings. So they both have a desire, but they can't be reconciled because they're at odds with one another, right? Then he continues to say these two warring ideals in one dark body. So you know that this two-ness, the American and the Blackness, he says, is at war, right? And Du Bois argues that the dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So it's only the strength that keeps these two warring ideals, these two bodies, these two thoughts, these two souls who are warring from tearing that body apart, is the strength of the person who occupies that body, right? So when I'm talking about Du Bois being in conversation with Gilroy, when Gilroy is thinking about double consciousness, he's talking about folks from the Caribbean who are going to Europe, right? Folks who are from West Africa who are going to Europe, right? So that same phenomenon is being reproduced as people are traversing from wherever they're coming from across the Atlantic, hence the title of the book, The Black Atlantic. So Gilroy's project or his exploration with this idea of double consciousness that Du Bois coins, right? That Du Bois comes up with is, how does this apply to those who are going to Europe? Does that make sense, Damon?
So Gilroy's writings came after Du Bois.
Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folks was published in 1903.
And when was Gilroy's
87.
working published? 1987?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay. Okay. Got it.
Okay. So the second question within Gilroy's text, why and how, right? So this is a two-part question. Why and how does the Atlantic, that body of water, right? How does that figure into Gilroy's project? So again, the title of the text is the Black Atlantic, right? He's thinking about what is the cause of modernity, right? What births this idea or this concept or this society that we're living in called that we call modernity, this epic we call modernity, right? And Gilroy is arguing that the production of this modernity is a byproduct or an outgrowth of those who traveled back and forth across the Atlantic. And not only, you know, the typical character who's traveling back and forth across the Atlantic, but the Black individual, those who are occupying Black bodies, their contributions in their traversing across the Atlantic, right? So why does this body of water become important for Gilroy's project? And you have to be able to discuss and dive into that. Is there any questions about or comments about that question?
For Du Bois, you quoted from one of his works. Was that an assigned reading, or was that just your personal record?
It's extra reading. That was from The Souls of Black Folks. Right. Remember what I said, Daniel? I said, if you want to bring anything outside from what we've read, that would be probably the only thing to do, because I talked about that in the course lecture.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions about the Atlantic? Okay, so the final question as it pertains to Gilroy, and again, this kind of bleeds into the next reading, which is Glissant. Why is the ship and nautical culture central for Gilroy's project, right? So why is the boat itself important? And then nautical culture, again, is just a culture that's developed around the boat. Cassandra?
I'm still confused about the why and how does Atlantic figure into Gilroy's project.
So, yeah, you want to go into that a little bit more. So think about it. The title of the text is The Black Atlantic, right? And the subtitle is Modernity and Double Consciousness, right? So we know that these are two things that are on Gilroy's mind as he's thinking about the Black Atlantic experience. So we know that he argues the production of modernity is due to these Black individuals who are going back and forth across the Atlantic, right? We know that when he's thinking about double consciousness, he's thinking about double consciousness in the sense of how are people from Trinidad and Tobago who are traveling to Europe experiencing this two-ness that Du Bois has talked about? How are people from Nigeria who are traveling to Europe experiencing this two-ness that Du Bois is talking about, right? So with all those things that are going on, what has become central within that conversation is the Atlantic, right? Because according to Gilroy, double consciousness wouldn't be a thing, because the only reason that you're experiencing double consciousness is because you're going back and forth to the Atlantic to experience that two-ness, right? According to Gilroy, modernity wouldn't even be a thing, because if there was no going forth beyond across the Atlantic, then we wouldn't even have what's called the New World, right? So for Gilroy, the Atlantic is central to his project because it allows him to investigate things like modernity and things like double consciousness. Does that make sense, Cassandra?
Really quick, sorry.
Yeah.
And just to clarify, the people who are going back and forth through the Atlantic and then experiencing this nautical culture, it referring to like Garvey's ship people as well?
That could be them too. Yep, absolutely, Damien. Yep. Yep. And again, and that's why I'm saying, don't separate the text, bring them into conversation, because to Damien's point, that nautical culture that Gilroy is talking about is case in point, those who were carrying the Negro world back and forth across the Atlantic, right? It all is in conversation with each other, right? Again, think about the title of the course, right? The course is about the Black Diaspora. So the way that the Black Diaspora is even produced is crossing the Atlantic at some capacity, right? The way that the Black Diaspora is produced is by African people going out and doing what we're calling world making, right? The way that the diaspora is produced is by Marcus Garvey establishing what we call self-determination and race pride. The way that the Black diaspora is produced is by shifting this idea of Pan-Africanism into a movement, right? So one thing to do as a scholar and a theoretician is to connect the dots. It's all connected, right? Any other questions before we move on to Glisson? Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Ahead,
I just wanted to ask. Oh, well, thank you. Let me turn my camera on. I haven't read Gilroy. I just wanted to know: is it like is it fictional, or is it like this is like a historical, like he's trying to doc, like what is he trying to do with this project, and
So,
what is it real, or is it like based on a story, or like what?
So read it, because that was the assignment, right?
Honestly, that's fair. All right.
Yeah, I know it's fair as fuck, because that's some real shit. Okay. Glisson. So one, we know that Glisson within the title, right, is a poetic. So when we're thinking about poetics, we kind of have to be a little bit more expansive in the way that we try to digest or understand this text. And this is why I assigned it last, because I kind of want to get you already in a mental exercise to engage dense text. And then, you know, at the end of the semester, kind of let you be a little bit more expansive, right? So we know that if we're dealing with poetics, we're dealing with imagery, we're dealing with metaphors, we're dealing with symbolism, right? And for this text, for the chapter that was read, the opening chapter, that metaphor, that symbol becomes the boat, right? And so ultimately you need to be able to discuss and grapple with this idea of the boat metaphor and state clearly what it's a metaphor for, right? He gives you very robust imagery of the metaphor, but I need you to state very clearly, the boat metaphor is a metaphor for blank, right? Does anyone want to ask a question or speak to that to get a very clear understanding of what that metaphor is about? Because this is one thing, although it's a poetic and is open for vast interpretation, this is really essential for understanding what he's trying to do. So is there any questions or anyone want to discuss the boat metaphor?
Okay. I don't know if we can say what we think it is.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
absolutely. That's what we're here for.
Okay. So from what I got from it, the boat is like a metaphor for like a new world, right? Like it's almost like a transitional thing. Like it's where new cultures were made. You know, it's with the three. How it says the three. I forgot the word, but it gave those three examples. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there we go. It's the womb, you know, it's new openings.
Okay.
That's what I got from it.
So yes, Damien, that's some of the work that the boat is doing, but it's a metaphor for something very specific. Caitlin?
I think from my notes, I picked up that the belly of the boat is like creolization of African language and cultures. And I think you mentioned it was because of like survival, right? How like you had to communicate, like African people had to communicate with one another and break down language barriers in order to like know what's going on the ship. And then even upon arrival to the States, they had to also again relearn and like place themselves at with each other on the land. Yeah.
Yes. So again, that's the byproduct of what happens on the boat, right? That creolization is the end result to a certain degree of what happens on the boat. But again, the boat is a very specified metaphor. So let's think about this. What's happening on the boat? So and again, I'll read a passage. And this is at the opening page of the open boat. The second paragraph, I'm looking towards the bottom. Imagine 200 human beings being crammed into a space barely capable of containing a third of them. Imagine vomit, naked flesh, swarming lice, the dead slumped, the dying crouched. Imagine, if you can, the swirling red of mounting to the deck, the ramp they climbed, the black sun on the horizon, vertigo. So this is on page, what was that? Page 5. That was the first page, Cassandra. So what's going on in that passage I just read? What is he asking you to imagine? I'll read it one more time. Imagine 200 human beings crammed into a space barely capable of containing a third of them. Imagine vomit, naked flesh, swarming lice, the dead slumped, the dying crouched. Imagine, if you can, the swirling red of mounting to the deck, the ramp they climbed, the black sun on the horizon, vertigo. What is he describing? And think more about the opening parts of that, right? The human beings cramped into a space barely containing a third of them. The vomit.
Is it like discomfort?
Because of what? What's happening? What's going on to make them discomfortable?
They're like packed up too much.
Mm-hmm. So what happened to African people that placed them on the boat cramped up and uncomfortable?
Is he talking? I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Go ahead, Stacey.
He's talking about the experience of them coming here, like
so where they,
how they got here, the way they got here.
So how did they get here? What experience is this, Stacey? Go ahead, like say it plain.
This is the experience of them being on the boat.
What type of boat? A cruise ship?
The slave. The slave ship. So this is their experience on the slave ship. This is I guess maybe this is the beginning of their of what happened to them. This is the beginning of them being who they are. Like it started from, it didn't, so in Africa they're Africans. They're not Africans on the boat, but this is the beginning of them becoming slaves or
Are they like being materialized?
Is it being, yes. So what he's talking about in all reality, Damien, is the materialization of this Creole production, right? This is how this culture of Creole gets materialized. This is how Africans become so-called African American, right? This is how Africans from West Africa become Jamaicans, Haitians. This is how, Puerto Ricans, aspects of certain parts of their demographic get developed, right? So yes, very much so, he's talking about a materialization, but what he's talking about the boat is significant because it's a metaphor for enslavement, right? That boat, what is not metaphorical is that boat is an enslavement ship, right? There's no metaphor about that. But what the symbolism is, what the metaphor is what has been produced through this horrific experience, what we call the Ma'afa, or the transatlantic enslavement period experience, right?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Stacey.
So you asked about what it could be a metaphor for. You said it's a metaphor for the beginning. We talked about last week how they mentioned the metaphor of the womb. Would it be fair to say, because slavery is being born, would it be fair to say that it's also, we could also mention that and if we were answering that question?
So, because this is where I want you to be careful and be clear on your distinction, right? So this question asks you about the boat, right? So where you get the womb brought into the picture is he begins to articulate the boat as a womb, right? So that presents a whole nother metaphor, because what he says with the womb is a womb abyss, because in this horrific experience, you don't think of a womb, but what a womb does, it produces something, it births something new, right? And so what Glissant is thinking about is what is newly birthed from this horrific experience: Creole languages, Creole culture, Creole food, right? Does that make sense, Stacey? Or did I lose you? Okay, cool. Any other questions about, so everyone understands what the boat symbolizes and what the boat is a metaphor for. So from there, we're thinking about the abyss, and we know that there are 3 stages of the abyss. So be able to talk about those stages, be able to bring those in conversation even with one another, right? Is anyone unclear about what those stages are? Okay.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I'm still kind of confused on the third metamorphosis, like what it is.
The third metamorphosis. Okay. So he says that the third metamorphosis is all that is left behind, right? Let me find the page. Give me 1 second. Okay.
Page 7.
7, yeah. So I'm looking at page 7, the second paragraph. Paralleling this mass of water. And Caitlin, I'm sorry, Cassandra, I see your question. I got you. Give me 1 second. So again, page 7, paragraph 2. Paralleling this mass of water, the third metamorphosis of the abyss thus projects a reverse image of all that had been left behind. So when you read that, think about a rear view mirror, right? So like you're driving somewhere and you look in the rear view mirror, right? And in that rear view mirror is all that you're left behind. So in this example, they on a boat, right? This boat happens to have a rear view mirror, and as it's headed further west into the Americas, you're seeing your former homeland, right? That's what's the image that you see within that rear view mirror, right? But he says all that you see in the rear view mirror is not to be regained. You're not going to be able to get that back for generations, right? Except more and more thoroughbred in the blue savanna of memory or imagination. Only way that you'll be able to retrace that is in your memory or in your imagination, right? And he says, for generations to come, you will not be able to get back what's lost. So the beginning of this semester, right, I was in Ghana, right? For part of my initiation for my spiritual tradition, which is also like a pilgrimage, if you will, right? That trip back across the Atlantic for me did not get back what was in the rear view mirror of my ancestors generations before me. I wasn't able to reconnect that severed connection, right? And that is what Glissant is arguing, So all those things, when you're kidnapped and placed onto the bottom of that boat that you were took from, the third metamorphosis of the abyss is that, right? Because remember, the abyss is the unknown, right? The abyss at the end of the day is the unknown, but you have three metamorphoses of that abyss. The first one being water, right? We now know that the last one is all that is left behind you, all that you've been taken from, right? Cassandra, well, one, Caitlin, are you good with the third metamorphosis?
Yes. Thank
Okay.
you.
Cassandra, do you need me to go back into the boat metaphor?
I mean, I'd like to you too, but if you need
Okay. I
me
mean,
to cover
I just need you to be, I would like for you to be comfortable, right? So at the end of the day, right? Let's start from the real. Let's not even deal with the metaphor. The boat is a slave ship, is an enslavement ship, right? No metaphor about that. That's cut and dry, plain and simple, right? This is what Glissant is talking about. But what this ship does, and what this ship is a metaphor or a symbol of, is all the things that get produced from this system or this institution of enslavement, right? So he's using the boat as a metaphor to talk about the byproducts of enslavement. He's arguing so think about it this way. Just like for Gilroy, the Atlantic allows him to talk about modernity and double consciousness, right? For Glissant in this chapter, the boat allows him to talk about things like creolization, talk about things like relation, right? So for the Glissant, the boat is a metaphor for enslavement, but not just purely enslavement, but an enslavement that produces new things. Does that make any sense for you?
Yeah.
You sure?
I just tend to get confused when everybody like tries to answer and then you correct them and then I'm like, wait, what's the correct answer then?
Okay, so
So that made sense now.
I'm gonna repeat the correct answer one more time, okay? The reality of the boat is that it's a slave ship. That's the reality. So if you're thinking about this question, start there, right? And then as you understand that he's talking about an enslavement ship, then begin to think about the metaphor. So what came from enslavement that he's talking about within this chapter? One is new languages. And in class, we talked about Creole being one of those new languages, right? So because of this boat being a metaphor, he's able to focus his attention on how new languages are being created. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so this is why, one, that what the boat is a metaphor for, but then two, why the boat allows Glissant to do the work that he wants to do with things like language and things like relations. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And then finally, what is relations? How does Glissant define or articulate relations? And then once you have established that, how would you define relations? Anybody want to speak to that? Because that would be the question that would close out the final order.
Is that a Glissant's definition versus our working definition?
Yes.
Or
So one, provide me Glissant's definition, right? And then give me yours. So I'm asking for both. So What I will say is for what relations is in the text in the book, look at page 8 towards the bottom of page 8, just because I'm looking at time and we've gone like already over, and I want to provide you one last assignment. Does everybody get that? So for the last question, as it pertains to how Glissant defines relations, that's on page 8 in the reading towards the bottom. That's about the best information I could give you without actually giving you the answer. Page 8 towards the bottom of the page. Any questions about that? So essentially, if you want to kind of like revisit this, if you're able to answer these questions, you'll do perfectly fine on the final. At the end of the day, what it will be, it'll be some version or some iteration of a combination of these questions. And that's going to make up your final questions, if that makes sense, right? So they'll either be like switched around in the phrasing, or they'll be combined with few of the other questions that you see on the study guide in a different phrasing, and that will make up what your final will be. So again, if you can answer these questions, feel fairly confident that you could answer the questions on the final, right? I wouldn't waste your time or put you on a wild goose chase. Is there any last minute questions about the final? Strictly final related questions? Omi, go ahead.
When will you be assigning or like posting the questions?
Early Friday morning, the 9th. Let me double
And
check.
then they'll be due on the 11th?
The 12th. In the day, the 12th.
Monday.
Yes, by like
By
11:59 p.m. Monday. And then, as I mentioned, if something comes up where that becomes impossible for you, please communicate with me as soon as possible. But that would be the assigned date, and then that would be the due date. Any other questions about the final? No.
Wait, okay, so Friday,
Sorry.
Saturday, Sunday, Monday.
4 days.
3 questions.
Yeah.
A question a day.
Yep. And that would
And
be
then
my
sorry, it'll be posted Friday morning or okay. And then the critical reviews are due the same day, same time?
Yep. Perfect. And I'll put all of this in detailed on Canvas as well. Anna?
I was just wondering, are you going to open up? So obviously we're going to turn it in through Canvas, correct? So when you open up the final, will the critical reviews be opened as well?
Yes.
Or?
Yes.
Okay, sounds good.
I'm going to do both of them at the same time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions about the final? All right. So